In the winter of 1892, I was hired as a junior orderly at Blackwood Asylum, a place the locals called the end of the world. It sat on a jagged cliff overlooking the gray Atlantic, a sprawling maze of cold stone and iron bars. My superior was a man named Chief Orderly Silas Vane. He was a giant of a man with a face like scarred leather and hands that could crush a skull like a dry walnut. He didn't believe in medicine, he believed in discipline. "Listen to me, boy," Vane said on my first night, his voice a low growl. "In this place, we aren't dealing with men. We are dealing with empty vessels that the devil filled with noise. Your job isn't to heal them. Your job is to keep the noise from leaking out." My primary duty was in the hydrotherapy wing, a fancy name for a basement filled with iron tubs where we submerged agitated patients in ice-cold water for hours. Vane called it cooling the humors. I called it torture. The most feared patient in the wing was Elias Vance, known to everyone as the Screamer. He had been a choir director before his mind shattered. Now, he didn't sing. He emitted a constant, high-pitched vibration that seemed to vibrate the very fillings in your teeth. One night, Vane decided that Elias needed the iron cradle. It was a medieval-looking contraption, a cage of heavy bars that kept the patient completely immobile while cold water dripped slowly onto their forehead, a method called the stillness. "He's too loud tonight," Vane grunted, dragging the terrified Elias toward the cage. "The noise is offensive. We're going to find the silence inside him, even if we have to dig for it." I watched in silent horror as Vane strapped Elias in. The man's eyes were rolling in his head, his mouth wide in a silent scream. As the first drop of ice water hit his brow, Elias stopped vibrating. He went perfectly, unnervingly still. "See?" Vane grinned, showing yellow teeth. "The silence is there. You just have to force it to the surface." But as the hours passed, something changed. The silence in the basement became heavy. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a presence. The torches on the walls flickered and turned a sickly green. I looked at Elias in the cage. His skin had turned a translucent gray, and his eyes, they were no longer looking at the ceiling. They were looking at Vane. Vane didn't notice. He was busy sharpening a long, thin needle, a tool for orbital exploration, a primitive form of lobotomy he practiced in secret. "Now," Vane whispered, leaning over Elias, "let's see where that music was hiding." As Vane lowered the needle, Elias's jaw didn't just open, it unhinged. A sound came out of him that wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000 glass windows shattering at once. The vibration was so intense that the iron tubs began to crack. Vane screamed, dropping the needle and clutching his ears, blood starting to seep from between his fingers. "Stop it!" Vane shrieked. "Quiet him!" I tried to move, but I was paralyzed. I watched as Elias's body began to twist and contort within the iron bars. His bones snapped and reset with the sound of dry wood breaking. He reached out with a hand that had grown too many joints and grabbed Vane by the throat. Vane, the man who had terrified hundreds of inmates, was reduced to a whimpering child. He tried to fight back, but Elias wasn't just holding him, he was absorbing him. The sound, that horrific, glass-shattering scream, began to flow from Elias's mouth into Vane's ears. I watched as Vane's eyes turned white. His skin began to gray, his features flapping until he looked like a doll made of wet clay. The noise was passing from the patient to the guard. When the morning shift arrived, they found me huddled in the corner, catatonic. The basement was flooded with ice water. The iron cradle was empty, the bars bent outward as if by a massive force. On the floor, they found two men. One was Elias Vance. He was sitting peacefully by a drain, humming a beautiful, angelic melody. He was perfectly sane, his eyes clear and kind for the first time in years. The other was Silas Vane. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the room. He didn't move when they touched him. He didn't blink when they shone a light in his eyes. He just stood there, his mouth open, emitting a constant, high-pitched vibration that made the orderly's teeth ache. Vane became the new screamer. They locked him in the same cell he had used for his victims. And every night, when the moon is full and the Atlantic waves crash against the Blackwood cliffs, you can hear him. But it's not a scream of madness. It's the sound of every soul he ever broke, all screaming back through his throat at once. I left Blackwood that day and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm in a perfectly silent room, I feel my teeth start to ache. And I know that somewhere, the silence is still waiting to be filled. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne, and for 20 years, I specialized in the architecture of the mind. I believed that madness was a solvable puzzle, a tangled knot that could be undone with logic and compassion. Then I took a position at St. Augustine's Asylum for the criminally insane. It wasn't a Gothic pile of brick. It was a modern, brutalist structure built in the late 1970s, all cold concrete and reinforced steel. It felt more like a fortress than a hospital. I was brought in to oversee a new wing, Unit C, designed for patients deemed unresponsive. They were not violent, they were simply absent, catatonic, staring blankly at walls, whispering to empty air, or sometimes just sitting perfectly still for days. My predecessors had dismissed them as beyond help. I saw them as a challenge. The first thing I noticed about Unit C was the silence. Not the quiet of a tranquil ward, but a heavy, almost suffocating silence that absorbed sound. Voices seemed to die the moment they left your lips. The second thing was the walls. They were unusually thick, almost a meter of solid concrete, specifically designed to be soundproof. But sometimes, when the ward was utterly still, I could swear I heard a faint humming, a low vibration that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. My initial weeks were routine. I observed, I documented, I prescribed. But the patients in Unit C never changed. They remained in their isolated worlds. There was Sarah, who meticulously picked invisible lint from her blanket for 12 hours a day. There was Mr. Abernathy, who whispered intricate, nonsensical mathematical equations to the corner of his room. And then there was Patient 7, a young woman whose name I never learned. She simply stared at the blank wall opposite her bed, never moving, never blinking. One night, during my rounds, I found Patient 7 in a new state. She wasn't catatonic. She was agitated, scratching frantically at the concrete wall with her fingernails. Her eyes, usually dull and unfocused, were wide with terror. "They're hungry," she rasped, her voice dry as parchment. "The walls, they're listening, and they're hungry." I dismissed it as a psychotic break, a rare moment of lucidity warped by delusion. I gently sedated her. But as I cleaned the faint scratch marks on the concrete, I noticed something. The wall felt warm. Not just from the ambient temperature of the room, but with a faint, almost imperceptible internal heat. And the humming, I heard it again, louder this time. A low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. Over the next few days, I began to notice patterns. Patients in Unit C would occasionally become agitated, often at odd hours of the night. Their ramblings, previously incoherent, started to contain common phrases. "The walls are hungry," "They want my thoughts," or "Don't let them in." I confided in Dr. Elena Petrova, a brilliant but cynical colleague. "Elias, it's a reinforced concrete building," she scoffed. "The humming is the HVAC system. The heat is residual from the building's core. And the walls are hungry is a classic schizophrenic delusion." But I couldn't shake the feeling. I started bringing a stethoscope on my rounds. One night, I pressed it against the wall of patient 7's room. Beneath the faint hum of the building, I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 like a slow, deep heartbeat. I decided to run a non-invasive experiment. I installed microsensors in patient 7's room, hidden within the ventilation grate. These sensors were designed to detect subtle changes in electromagnetic fields, minute vibrations, and even unusual atmospheric pressure. The data I collected was nonsensical: spikes in static electricity at random intervals, low-frequency vibrations that didn't match the building's structure, and, most chillingly, faint echoes of sound, almost like whispers that the sensors picked up from within the solid concrete. One evening, I was reviewing the data when a new anomaly appeared. Patient 7's brainwave activity, which had been flatlined for months, showed a sudden, frantic burst of alpha and beta waves, a sign of extreme agitation. Simultaneously, the wall sensors registered a massive spike in localized electromagnetic activity and a strong, rhythmic vibration. I rushed to her room. Patient 7 was clawing at the wall again, her face contorted in a silent scream. Her lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear through the thick glass of the observation window. I quickly opened the door, and as I stepped inside, the humming intensified, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. "What is it, Patient 7?" I asked, my voice trembling.
She stopped scratching. She turned to me, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. "They're listening to you too, Doctor," she whispered. "They want your thoughts. They want to feel what you feel." Suddenly, the lights in her room flickered. The humming became a low growl that resonated through the concrete. I felt a pressure in my head, a dull ache behind my eyes. It felt as if something was pushing in, trying to access my mind. I backed away, terrified. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Petrova was right. I was becoming paranoid. The asylum was getting to me. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. Then I heard a sound from inside the wall. Not a hum, not a thump, a distinct, clear click, like a lock engaging. I looked at the door, the thick steel door to patient 7's room. There was no internal lock. It locked from the outside. I pressed the button on the control panel. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The door remained sealed. Panic seized me. I heard a faint, distorted laugh from behind the steel. It wasn't patient 7. It was deeper, colder. It was the sound of a satisfied predator. I ran to the main control room. I tried to override the lock system for Unit C. All the systems were unresponsive. It was as if the wing itself had decided to seal itself off. "Elena!" I screamed into the intercom. "Something's wrong with Unit C. I can't open patient 7's door." Her voice came back, calm and collected. "Elias, I'm looking at the central console. All doors in Unit C are showing as locked and secured. Patient 7's door is specifically listed as manual override engaged." "But I didn't engage it," I cried. "No, Elias, you didn't. The system did. The records show that the manual override for patient 7's door was engaged by Dr. Elias Thorne 2 days ago." My blood ran cold. I had no memory of doing any such thing. Had the pressure in my head, the humming, the fear, had it all been an elaborate manipulation? Was I the one going mad? I looked at the monitor displaying the live feed from patient 7's room. She was no longer scratching at the walls. She was sitting upright in her bed, staring directly into the camera. A faint, satisfied smile played on her lips.
and on the wall behind her, where the sensors were located, I saw a subtle outline, a faint, almost invisible crack in the concrete, shaped like a mouth, and it looked like it was widening. I didn't stay to find out what happened to patient 7. I submitted my resignation the next morning. I told them the asylum's architecture was unsound and that the building itself was suffering from a structural psychosis. They called it a breakdown. I called it survival. I never specialized in the mind again. I now work in historical archives where the only secrets are written on decaying paper. But sometimes, late at night, when my apartment building is utterly silent, I press my ear against my own wall, and I hear it, the faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 and the distant, soft hum. And I know the walls are still listening, and they are still hungry.
By 1895, Blackwood Asylum had become a graveyard for the living, but its most restricted area was the solarium on the 5th floor. It was a circular room with a glass ceiling, though the glass was so coated in soot and grime that no sunlight ever reached the floor. This was the laboratory of Dr. Alistair Sterling. Sterling was a man of extreme elegance and zero empathy. He wore white silk gloves even during surgery, and he spoke about human despair as if it were a minor chemical imbalance. He didn't believe in the spirit. He believed the mind was a machine that had simply jammed. "You see, boy," he told me as I wheeled in a fresh patient, "madness is not a cloud in the sky. It is a parasite, a physical, fleshy thing that attaches itself to the brainstem. And like any parasite, it can be extracted. The problem is, it needs a host." My job as his assistant was to hold the patients down. The patient that night was Thomas, a former watchmaker who had lost his family in a fire. He was catatonic, his hands constantly moving as if he were still assembling invisible gears in the air. Sterling didn't use ether. He claimed that the parasite would hide if the patient was unconscious. He began the procedure by making a precise incision behind Thomas's ear. As Sterling worked with his silver scalpels, the room grew unnaturally cold. The gas lamps flickered, and for a moment, the soot on the glass ceiling seemed to swirl into the shape of a massive, watching eye. "There," Sterling whispered, his eyes wide with a feverish light. "I see it." He reached into the wound with a pair of long, thin forceps. He pulled out something that made my stomach heave. It wasn't a tumor or a blood clot. It was a translucent, pulsing thread, gray and slimy, about 3 feet long. It looked like a nerve, but it was moving on its own, twitching like a dying worm. As soon as the thread was removed, Thomas's hands stopped moving. His eyes cleared. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, there was a human being behind those pupils. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. But Sterling wasn't finished. He didn't destroy the thread. He held it up to the light, admiring its rhythmic pulsing. "Beautiful, isn't it? The concentrated essence of grief. Pure, unadulterated sorrow." Then he turned to me. "The parasite cannot survive without a home, Arthur, and I must study its effects on a healthy mind to truly understand the cure." Before I could scream, Sterling lunged. He didn't use a knife on me. He simply pressed the gray, pulsing thread against the back of my neck. The sensation was like 1,000 needles of ice being driven into my spine. My vision didn't go dark, it turned red. Every memory of Thomas's life, the smell of the smoke, the screams of his children, the heat of the fire, flooded into my brain like a tidal wave. I wasn't just remembering his grief, I was becoming it. Sterling watched me with clinical detachment, scribbling notes in his leather-bound journal. "Fascinating," he muttered. "The transfer is nearly instantaneous.
The host's original personality is suppressed by the weight of the foreign trauma. I tried to fight it, but the parasite was hungry. It began to weave itself into my own nerves. I could feel Thomas's sorrow eating my joy, his memories erasing my own. I looked at Thomas, who was now standing up, his face filled with a terrifying, blank peace. He looked at Sterling, then at me, and walked out of the room without a word. He was cured, but he was empty. I, however, was full of a fire that wasn't mine. "Now, Arthur," Sterling said, leaning in close, "tell me, do you still remember your mother's face, or is it just ashes now?" The rage that surged through me wasn't mine, but I used it. I grabbed the heavy surgical tray and swung it with the strength of a dying man. The silver instruments scattered like rain. I pinned Sterling against his own operating table. "You wanted to see the effect?" I roared, my voice sounding like a chorus of Thomas's lost children. I grabbed the forceps, still sticky with the gray thread that was now half buried in my own neck. With a scream of agony, I ripped the thing out of my flesh. It took pieces of my own nerves with it, but I didn't care. I shoved the pulsing gray mass into Sterling's open mouth and held his jaw shut. The elegant doctor's eyes went wide. His silk gloves clawed at his throat. The gray thread didn't wait for an incision. It was a parasite. It knew how to burrow. It slid down his throat, eager for a fresh, arrogant mind to feast upon. Sterling didn't die. That would have been too kind. The parasite didn't just give him Thomas's grief. It gave him the grief of every patient he had ever cleaned. It gave him the collective agony of Blackwood Asylum. When the orderlies found us, I was bleeding on the floor, my mind a tattered ruin, but finally quiet. Sterling was sitting in the center of the solarium, staring at the soot-covered glass. He wasn't screaming, he was simply making a sound like a ticking clock. Tick, tick, tick. Over and over, his hands moving in the air, forever assembling the gears of a life he had stolen. They locked him in a cage in the basement, the very place he used to send the hopeless cases. I left the asylum that night, carrying scars on my neck that will never fade. I live in a quiet house now, far from the city. I don't read the papers, and I don't visit doctors, but every time I see a silver thread or a wisp of gray smoke, I feel a phantom itch at the base of my skull. And I wonder, how many more cures are still walking the streets, empty and hollow, while their souls are being kept in a journal on a madman's desk?